Stay still under pressure. The first game in Squid Game is designed to make you flinch, but not because you're weak, because you're human. When the doll turns, the silence is unbearable. Your breath tightens, your balance shifts, and somewhere deep in your nervous system, your body prepares to move, just in case. But here's the truth. Survival, in moments like that, depends on resisting your own reflexes. This isn't unique to games. In real-world high-stakes situations, interviews, emergencies, confrontations, people sabotage themselves by overreacting to silence. They mistake stillness for danger and feel a compulsion to do something just to feel in control. But stillness is control. Picture a negotiation. The first person to speak after a difficult question usually loses their leverage. The person who pauses before acting is the one who doesn't make the wrong move. This trick isn't about freezing. It's about self-regulation. Learning to let discomfort pass through you without translating it into motion. If your heart's pounding, fine. But your hands, your feet, they stay locked. You're allowed to feel fear. Just don't let it drive the next move. Never volunteer for the first round. In any unfamiliar game, especially one with hidden rules, the first move carries the most risk. You don't know the boundaries yet. You don't know the consequences. And if you go first, everyone else learns from your mistakes while you pay the price. That's not bravery. That's donating your data. In Squid Game's Glass Bridge Challenge, early players weren't brave. They were bait. Every step they took gave others more information. The winners weren't the ones who jumped first. They were the ones who waited. This shows up constantly in the real world. In meetings, the first person to pitch an idea frames the discussion. But they also expose their thinking to critique before anyone else has risked a word. In group interviews, the first responder has no baseline. Everyone after them sounds more thoughtful just by comparison. Even socially, the first to overshare at a new job or event often becomes the odd one out. Not because they said something wrong, but because they lacked context. Delaying your move isn't passivity, it's strategy. Use the time to observe, read the room, learn the rules before you start playing. Because when information is limited, the biggest advantage is going second. Break the rhythm, stay invisible. In the Honeycomb Challenge, most Squid Game players panic before they even sit down. They scratch fast, hands shaking, trying to free the shape as quickly as possible, like it's a race. But it isn't. There's no timer, no advantage to being first. The guards don't care who finishes early. They only react when you break your shape or break the rules. That's it. So the real danger isn't the sugar, it's the stress. The ones who survive take a different approach. They don't scratch harder. They soften the problem. Literally. They lick the back of the cookie. They slow down. They lower their heart rate. They make small moves, not big ones. They don't match the panic of the room. They reject the rhythm. You'll see this same trap in everyday life, especially under pressure. Everyone's talking fast in a group interview, so you do too. Everyone's rushing in traffic, so you follow. Everyone's buying, so you buy. But most of the time, the fastest rhythm isn't the smartest. It's just the loudest. Want to win quietly? Break the rhythm. In a negotiation, let silence stretch longer than expected. In an argument, drop your voice instead of raising it. In a test, ignore the page flipping around you and stick to your pace. The one who breaks rhythm isn't seen as slower. They're seen as more certain. And when stress is external, calm becomes invisible. Nobody targets the still one. In Squid Game or out here, the world watches who breaks first. Don't let it be you. Use the noise as cover. In high-pressure environments, most people try to avoid standing out. But the real trick isn't invisibility, it's camouflage. When you're in a loud environment, you don't need to be silent. You just need to blend. That's why, in the chaos of the Squid Game hallway, dozens of players moving, talking, panicking, the smart ones don't freeze. They move when others move, sit when others sit, talk just enough to not get noticed for staying too quiet. It's not about shrinking, it's about hiding in the pattern. In real life, this works too, especially when you're not ready yet. New job? Don't speak first in the meeting. Let the early voices set the tempo, the expectations, the social map. Then, when you do speak, you know where the lines are. At a party, a networking event, a team presentation, you don't need to rush your presence. Use the ambient noise. Observe. Let the first few minutes act as your cover. Because while others are spending energy making a first impression, you're gathering data. The psychological edge is this: we mistake noise for leadership, but often the person making the most noise is still guessing. The one listening is preparing, waiting, calibrating. The goal isn't to disappear. The goal is to become unremarkable until you decide otherwise. Don't pick the obvious. Ally. In survival scenarios and social ones, your first instinct is usually wrong. In Squid Game, most people gravitate toward the strongest looking players, the loudest voices, the confident ones. They assume protection comes from power. But in the marble game, that thinking gets people killed. You don't need a partner with muscles. You need one who panics slower than you do. This isn't a show about dominance. It's about misreading people under pressure. Now take that into real life. In group projects, early alliances often form around charisma. At work, new hires gravitate toward extroverts. But the person who seems most socially in control isn't always the most reliable when things go sideways. Look at startup teams. The founder who's all pitch and no build usually burns out. The quiet co-founder, the one who listens more than they speak, is the one still standing when things get tough. Or in crisis situations, the friend who talks the most in calm moments may vanish the fastest when stress hits. The steady person, the one who didn't draw attention early on, is often the one who thinks clearly when everyone else freezes. The trick is to look past the obvious. Don't pick based on surface signals. Pick based on patterns. Who stays level? Who doesn't rush? Who listens more than they posture? Your survival, or at least your sanity, might depend on it. The least safe spot is the one everyone thinks is safe. In high-stakes environments, safety in numbers feels comforting, but that feeling is often outdated. In Squid Game's tug-of-war, players instinctively want the strongest teammates, the tall, broad-shouldered ones. That's the default bias. Physical power equals survival. But the old man's team wins, not because of muscle, but because of technique. They lean back at an angle. They hold for 10 full seconds. They use coordination over force. And they break the other team's rhythm. Why does this work? Because the game isn't about raw strength. It's about outlasting panic. In real life, the obvious path, the loud leader, the confident consensus, the common method, isn't always the safe one. People crowd into what's worked before, even if it no longer fits the actual rules. Hiring only by resume. Following industry best practices without context. Copying competitors instead of asking, what's really going on here? The more people default to the same safety net, the less tension it can carry. Sometimes the safest place to be is one step to the side. Control the frame. Before you enter, the first 5 seconds decide whether you're respected, dismissed, or ignored. It's not about impressing, it's about framing. In Squid Game's Marble Challenge, many players walk into the game blind. They panic, negotiate badly, or even trust the wrong person. They wait for the environment to define the terms, and by then, it's too late. But think of Gi-hun. He doesn't just play the game, he frames it. He controls the pace. He bends the rules emotionally. He shifts his opponent's focus from winning to believing. That's not manipulation, it's presence. He sets the tone before the game begins. In everyday life, this happens constantly. Walk into a meeting with scattered papers and an apology, and you've framed yourself as disorganized. Enter calmly, say one clear sentence, and the room aligns with your energy. Same content, different frame, a job interview. If you start by listing weaknesses, you've taught them to see you through that lens. Start by asking a smart question. Now you've reframed the power dynamic. Before any interaction, ask, what frame do I want to walk in with? Confidence, curiosity, calm. Then behave like someone who already earned it. The calmest voice controls the room. In tense situations, people instinctively match the loudest energy in the room, but the person who speaks slower, quieter, and with intention usually gets listened to first and last. It's not charisma, it's contrast. In Squid Game's tug of war, the old man doesn't scream to lead. He speaks softly while everyone else panics. And they follow, not because of his volume, but because of his composure. That calmness cuts through the noise, creates focus, and changes the group's energy. You see this in real life too. A heated argument at work, 5 voices overlapping, no progress. Then someone speaks at half the volume, waits an extra second, and everyone stops. That voice isn't dominant, it's anchored. And that anchoring creates authority without saying, I'm in charge. In parenting, the same effect happens. A kid spirals into meltdown, and yelling back just escalates. But speak slowly, keep your tone flat, and they downshift with you. Calmness is contagious. So is chaos. In social settings, even when you're nervous, lowering your voice slightly, instead of raising it to sound confident, makes others lean in. It turns attention into respect. You don't need to command a room. You just need to slow it down. Ask first, talk second. In moments of uncertainty, people rush to prove they know what they're doing. But the smartest move, especially in unfamiliar territory, is to ask before you act. In Squid Game, this principle quietly shows up in the marble game. Some players start making wild guesses about the rules. Others, like Gi-hun, ask questions, observe, listen. The ones who pause to learn tend to survive longer, not because they're smarter, but because they gather context before making a move. In real life, this is a skill with massive payoff. In a new job, the people who say, "Can I see how you've done this before?" tend to succeed faster than those who pretend they already know. In high-pressure environments, courtrooms, operating rooms, business negotiations, asking one good question is often worth more than making 10 assumptions. Here's the twist. Asking doesn't make you look weak. It makes you look responsible. You're signaling that you care more about getting it right than looking right. And there's a hidden bonus. When you ask for advice, people invest in your success. You've included them. That creates a subtle alliance. So before you jump in, ask something, anything, even just, how did you do it? That moment of humility can save you more than pride ever will. Spotlight effect. When you're nervous, it's easy to feel like all eyes are on you. Every step, every stumble, every hesitation, amplified. But that's just a distortion your brain creates. It's called the spotlight effect, and it makes you think people are noticing far more than they actually are. During Squid Game's tug-of-war challenge, panic could be fatal. Some players froze, not because the strategy was hard, but because they imagined everyone was watching them mess up. In reality, no one cared about the individual. They only saw the outcome, the team that pulled together, or didn't. In real life, this distortion shows up everywhere. In classrooms when you get an answer wrong, in meetings when you forget a point, or at the gym when you're trying a new routine. You assume people notice. Most don't. They're too caught up in their own internal monologues. Here's the fix. Treat your anxiety like a trick mirror. Acknowledge the feeling, then move through it. Focus on the task, not the theater. Confidence comes not from perfect performance, but from realizing the audience is mostly in your head. Let them correct you. One of the fastest ways to build trust isn't to prove you're right. It's to give someone space to prove you're wrong. When people correct you, they feel ownership. Their guard drops. You're no longer a threat. You're someone who listens. In Squid Game, the marble game was quiet, intimate, but deadly. Players had to convince their partner to play their way without making them defensive. The smart ones didn't argue. They asked questions. They guessed wrong on purpose. They let the other person feel in control. And in those moments, control was everything. You'll see this play out in daily life too. At work, when someone corrects your phrasing in a presentation and you thank them instead of doubling down, they feel heard. In relationships, when you say, "I might be wrong, but," you open the door for dialogue instead of debate. Even in high-stakes negotiations, letting the other side explain why you're wrong can be a power move. Because now they're investing, they're involved. The goal isn't to pretend to be ignorant. It's to create a shared moment of clarity, one they feel they helped build. Letting someone correct you isn't weakness, it's strategic humility. Authority bias is the tendency to place more trust in the opinions or instructions of someone perceived as an authority, even when the logic is weak or the request is questionable. It's a shortcut. If they're in charge, they must know better. This concept was famously explored in Stanley Milgram's obedience experiments in the 1960s. Participants, believing they were administering electric shocks to another person, continued increasing the voltage simply because a man in a lab coat told them to. Most were visibly distressed, but obeyed anyway, not out of malice, but out of deference. You see this bias in offices, hospitals, courtrooms, even in everyday life. People will agree with a manager's bad idea. Patients hesitate to question doctors. Passengers follow flight crew instructions, even when confused. The presence of authority quiets independent thinking. In Squid Game, authority bias is used to control players. The masked guards, the front man, even the calm voice over the speakers, all create the illusion of structure. Nobody explains the rules. No one proves the fairness. But most players comply, assuming the system has logic simply because it's enforced with uniformed order. Few question. Fewer resist. Understanding authority bias isn't about rebellion. It's about clarity. Ask yourself, am I agreeing because it makes sense? Or because someone said it confidently in a uniform or from a podium? Respect authority, but don't surrender thought. The cost of blind obedience is always paid by those who follow first. The confidence loop. Confidence doesn't start from within. It starts from how you're seen. When someone treats you like you're capable, even before you believe it, you start to act the part. That action earns a response, and that response loops back into belief. This loop is how quiet people become leaders. Not overnight, but gradually, through recognition. A teacher says, "You've got a good mind for this." A friend hands you the keys and says, "I trust you to drive." And suddenly, you do. In Squid Game, this is clearest during the tug-of-war match. On paper, their team should have lost. Weaker, smaller, no edge. But then the old man, the least expected source, started speaking like he'd done this 100 times, calmly. With clarity, he spoke strategy. He gave the team belief before they even pulled the rope. And it worked. Not because they got stronger, but because the loop clicked into place. You can use this too. Next time someone's unsure, act like you expect them to succeed. Say, "You've got the right instincts here." Watch how their posture shifts. Then reflect that shift back. Confidence is rarely born. It's mirrored. Most people already know their doubts. What they need is someone to mirror their potential, just enough to help them believe it's real. Break the script. People live by scripts, unspoken social routines that guide behavior. In meetings, you nod at the right time. On dates, you say, "Sounds great," even when it doesn't. These patterns help us move smoothly through life, but they also make us invisible. Breaking the script gently snaps people awake. It creates surprise without threat. A barista asks, "How's your day?" And instead of "Good, you say, "Honestly?" A little strange, but in a fun way. Now it's not just another exchange, it's a moment. In Squid Game, this plays out during the marble game. Everyone enters with one assumption: you'll need to beat the other player. But Gi-hun flips the script. He acts like a partner, not a competitor. He builds trust, distracts, slows the tempo. And while that moment is full of betrayal, the shift works. Because the other man never saw it coming. He was still playing the old game. You don't need deception to break a pattern. Just pause when others rush. Compliment someone in a quiet moment. Ask a question no one expects. Script breaking doesn't have to be big. It just has to be different, enough to be remembered. Most people move through routines without noticing. But one honest disruption, kind, curious, unexpected, can shift a whole dynamic. Speak slower to sound smarter. When you speak quickly, people assume you're nervous, or that you're trying to rush past uncertainty. But when you slow your speech, it signals control, thoughtfulness, authority. It gives your words more weight and your listener more time to process them. Research shows that slower speakers are often rated as more intelligent and persuasive, even when saying the same things. In a job interview or a tense conversation, this can make all the difference. A pause before answering shows you're not reactive. You're deliberate. And when you articulate clearly, people lean in. They assume you have something worth hearing. In Squid Game, consider the tug-of-war challenge. At first glance, it's brute strength, but the team that wins doesn't rush. They hold steady, breathe in, sink, and only then pull. The leader's calm voice, counting the rhythm, is what saves them. He doesn't shout. He slows everyone down. And that's what creates the opening. Speed feels like action, but clarity comes from stillness. And the most confident voices aren't the loudest. They're the ones that make space between their words. Frame it as a choice. When people feel they have a choice, they're far more likely to cooperate. Even if the outcome is the same, the perception of agency changes the response. Saying, "You can do this now or after lunch," is received very differently than "do this now." One triggers compliance, the other, quiet resistance. This is why good negotiators, teachers, and even parents often rephrase commands into controlled options. It doesn't mean giving up power. It means guiding outcomes while preserving the other person's autonomy. The brain resists pressure, but relaxes when it senses control. In Squid Game, this shows up long before the games begin. After the initial round of trauma, the players are given a vote: leave or stay. It's not a trick. They really do vote, and they leave. But then most of them come back. Why? Because now it feels like a choice. The organizers didn't chase them or threaten them. They let them decide. And once the players chose to return, they felt more committed, even responsible for what followed. In real life, when you give someone a path to choose, even a narrow one, they're more likely to walk it willingly. And when you choose your own path, you're more likely to stick with it, even when it gets difficult. Point your feet, reveal. Intent, body language, leaks information before words ever do. One of the most overlooked signals is where your feet are pointed. While people can fake eye contact or force a smile, feet tend to stay honest. If someone's feet are angled toward the door, they probably want to leave. If they're turned toward you, even if their torso isn't, they're engaged. It's a subconscious signal of intent, attention, and alignment. This trick is often used in sales and negotiation. A sharp observer can spot discomfort, disinterest, or attraction just by noticing how someone stands. In group dynamics, noticing where the feet point often reveals who the real leader is. People unconsciously angle themselves toward the person with the most influence. In Squid Game, there's a moment during the nighttime chaos in the dorms, when players fear an all-out brawl, where those who survive aren't always the strongest, but the ones who read the room fastest. Who's standing still? Who's edging toward the shadows? Who's already squared up, feet braced? Watching the way people stand reveals more than what they say. In high-stakes settings, whether it's a dangerous game or just a tense meeting, learning to read intention before action gives you time to move, choose, survive. And sometimes, knowing who isn't facing you is the clearest sign of who might be a threat. Ask for a small favor to build bond. It sounds backwards, but one of the fastest ways to make someone like you is to ask them for help. Psychologists call it the Ben Franklin effect. When you ask someone to do you a small favor, lending a pen, explaining a task, giving advice, they subconsciously justify their own action by assuming they like you. I helped them, so they must be worth helping. It flips the usual logic. Instead of doing favors because we like someone, we often like them because we did them a favor. This doesn't just work in theory. You'll see it in workplaces, classrooms, even casual conversations. Ask someone to send you a file, walk you through a tool, or hold your coffee for a second. It's not about the task. It's about giving them a low-effort way to invest in the connection. In Squid Game, this effect plays out between Gi-hun and the old man in the tug-of-war team. When Gi-hun listens to the old man's advice, when he lets him contribute instead of being protected, something shifts. The old man becomes more attached, more involved, more emotionally aligned. Because he was allowed to give, most people are used to being asked for nothing or for too much. But when you ask for just enough, a small favor, an honest input, you're letting them feel useful. And that small act of giving builds trust far faster than trying to impress them ever could. Use silence to own space. In most conversations, the instinct is to fill silence. We rush to answer, explain, soften a pause. But used correctly, silence can do the opposite. It commands attention. Psychologically, silence creates a vacuum. People lean in. They interpret it as confidence, control, or depth, depending on how you carry it. A moment of stillness before you speak can make even a short sentence sound more deliberate. A pause after a point can let it land harder. Silence, when held calmly, doesn't signal absence, it signals composure. This shows up in leadership, negotiations, interviews. The person who answers immediately often feels reactive. The one who waits a beat, then responds. They set the rhythm. You see it with experienced speakers, therapists, and great listeners. The space between words becomes part of the message. In Squid Game, the quietest players often survive longer. Not just because they're unnoticed, but because they don't give their position away. During the marble game, some contestants talk too much, too soon. Others stay quiet, listen first, adapt. In a setting where every word can be used against you, silence becomes defense and strategy. So next time you're in a tense room, whether it's a job interview or a disagreement, don't race to speak. Sit with the silence. Let them wonder what you're thinking. You don't need to raise your voice to be heard. Sometimes you just need to stop talking first. Show palm. Gain trust. Instantly. There's a reason open palms have been used in greetings for thousands of years. Psychologically, they signal honesty, non-aggression, and openness. When someone shows their palms, whether while talking, gesturing, or simply resting their hands, our brains subconsciously interpret it as, I'm not hiding anything. It's not about overacting or being theatrical. Small palm-facing gestures during conversation can make your words feel more trustworthy. Even in interviews or tense discussions, showing your palms briefly while making a point can help disarm the listener. It's body language that says, "This is safe." You'll notice this in everyday life. Confident speakers gesture with palms visible. Mediators keep their hands unclenched and open. Even in parenting, when emotions run high, a calm, open-handed gesture can settle a child faster than raised voices ever will. In Squid Game, trust is currency. In the tug-of-war challenge, Gi-hun's team survives not because of strength, but because they coordinated, fast. And before that happened, they had to trust each other. One of the few moments in the show where body language mattered more than words. When players dropped their guarded stances and showed even a small signal of openness, alliances could form. The trick isn't about being naive. It's about signaling, "You don't need to be on guard with me." In stressful or high-stakes situations, that's often the only invitation needed to shift the entire dynamic. Compliment behind their back. There's a psychological trick that builds influence without ever looking like flattery. Speak well of someone when they're not in the room. People tend to find out, through others, through tone shifts, or even directly. And when they do, it carries far more weight than if you'd told them face to face. That's because indirect praise feels less performative. It implies sincerity. If someone hears you called them sharp or solid behind their back, their trust in you grows, often without needing a single conversation. Studies show we're more likely to trust people who advocate for us privately than those who flatter us publicly. You can use this deliberately. Speak positively about a teammate to their manager. Mention someone's strengths to mutual friends. Let the compliment travel. It always sounds better when it wasn't meant to be heard. In Squid Game, alliances are fragile. But consider the moment when Gi-hun talks about Ali's loyalty to another player. That moment plants a seed. Later, when they need to choose partners, those quiet affirmations shape who's trusted and who's left behind. Even outside the arena, this works. Relationships, personal or professional, thrive on reputation. You don't have to campaign. Just be quietly generous with your words, especially when you think someone might deserve a little more recognition than they're getting. Use "we" instead of "you." There's a subtle linguistic shift that changes how people hear you. Replace "you" with "we." You need to calm down, put someone on the defensive. "We need to stay calm" feels like partnership. This isn't just wordplay, it's psychology. Studies show that people respond better to inclusive language, especially in moments of tension or uncertainty. It softens instruction, builds alignment, and lowers resistance. "We" signals shared goals. "You" signals direction. One builds trust. The other builds walls. It works especially well when stakes are high. In workplaces, leaders who say, "We're figuring this out together," get more cooperation than those who bark orders. In parenting, "we need to get out the door" is received better than "you're making us late." The same is true in relationships, conflict resolution, even negotiations. People don't like to be corrected, but they do like to be included. In Squid Game, this shows up in the tug-of-war challenge. One player doesn't say, "You all need to pull harder." He says, "We need a strategy." The shift in tone changes how the group responds. They stop panicking. They start thinking. And it's that small turn in mindset, not strength, that gives them a chance. Language shapes perception. If you want someone to feel like you're on the same side, speak like it. Say "we" and mean it. Break the script. Control the moment. Most social situations run on autopilot. You greet someone, they smile. You ask, "How are you?" They say, "Good, you." These scripts keep things moving, but they also make you forgettable. Breaking the script gently disrupts that rhythm. It catches attention without aggression. Say something just slightly off pattern. Instead of "nice to meet you," try "I've heard good things already." Instead of nodding through a meeting, ask a question no one expects. These moments are sticky. They feel alive. Psychologists call this pattern interruption. When a routine is disrupted, the brain pays closer attention. It works in interviews, first impressions, creative pitches, anytime you want to stand out. Not by being louder, just by being real. In Squid Game, script breaking saves lives. During the marble challenge, players assume the game is about beating each other, but one contestant changes the terms, proposes a partnership, shifts the tone. It doesn't last, but for a while, it works. The other player lowers his guard, because the interaction no longer fits the expected frame. You don't have to be manipulative, you just have to be awake. When everyone's doing the expected thing, doing one honest thing, unexpected, kind, curious, can give you control, not of the whole situation, but of that one moment. And sometimes, that's enough. Breath synchrony. In psychology, breath synchrony refers to the natural mirroring that happens when people feel emotionally connected, especially in calm, trusting situations. But it can also be used deliberately. If someone is anxious and you subtly match their breathing pattern, then gradually slow your own, their body often follows without realizing it. It's called physiological entrainment, and it's been studied in therapeutic settings, conflict de-escalation, and even hostage negotiation. Psychologist Stephen Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory, explains that our nervous systems constantly scan for cues of safety, and synced breathing is one of them. When you're with someone who's calm and their breath is slow and steady, your system starts to mirror it, not consciously, biologically. In Squid Game, the panic during red light, green light is contagious. People start sprinting, gasping, screaming. But the players who survive often mirror something else: calm, stillness. They slow down, focus their breath, and even influence those nearby to do the same. It's a ripple effect. You don't always need to lead with your voice. Sometimes breath is enough. In real life, if someone's spiraling, in an argument, on stage, or even in a hospital waiting room, you can't tell them to calm down, but you can breathe steadily next to them. Match, then guide. Let their nervous system take the cue. It's not mystical, it's behavioral science. The Ben Franklin effect. The Ben Franklin effect is a psychological phenomenon where asking someone to do you a small favor makes them more likely to like you, not less. It's counterintuitive. We assume doing something nice for someone builds trust, but research shows that when they do something for you, their brain subconsciously justifies the action. If I help this person, I must like them. This was first observed by Benjamin Franklin himself, who won over a rival politician by asking to borrow a rare book. The man complied, and afterward treated Franklin as a friend. Psychologist John Jecker confirmed this in a 1969 study. Participants who did small favors for someone ended up liking that person more than those who received favors. In Squid Game, this shows up between Gi-hun and Ali. Early on, Gi-hun drops something, and Ali catches it, a simple gesture. Later, Gi-hun leans on Ali for help again, and again. Each time, Ali grows more bonded, not because Gi-hun gave to him, but because he gave to Gi-hun. That bond, while tragic in the show's context, starts with one small act of help. In real life, the trick isn't manipulation, it's cooperation. When you invite someone to contribute, they feel valuable. And once they've helped you, they start rooting for you too. It builds connection, not through performance, but participation. Reciprocity norm. The reciprocity norm is one of the most powerful and universal social rules. When someone gives you something, you feel compelled to give something back. It's not just cultural, it's psychological. Sociologist Alvin Gouldner popularized the term in the 1960s, and studies since have confirmed its global presence. Whether it's a gift, a compliment, or even a shared secret, we're wired to repay kindness. It maintains balance in relationships and builds social glue. This principle is so strong that it's used in marketing, diplomacy, and even manipulation. Free samples? They aren't just generosity, they're triggering reciprocity. When someone starts by giving, we're more likely to say yes to a follow-up request, even if we wouldn't have before. In Squid Game, Saebyok gives a bottle of water to a newly arrived player. It's small, barely noticed. But later, that same player chooses her as a teammate. Not because she asked, but because she gave first. That moment of early generosity creates a subtle sense of debt, and in the game's brutal logic, even emotional debts become leverage. In real life, this doesn't mean being calculating. It means understanding that generosity is rarely forgotten. Offer first, even something small. People remember who made the first move, not just what it cost. Social proof. Social proof is the psychological tendency to assume that if other people are doing something, it must be the right thing to do. Coined by psychologist Robert Cialdini in his foundational work Influence, the principle explains why we're more likely to eat at a crowded restaurant, laugh when others laugh, or check reviews before making a choice. It reduces uncertainty. When unsure, we look to others, especially when the stakes feel high or the environment is unfamiliar. It's deeply rooted in survival. If everyone's running, you probably should too. But in modern life, it affects everything from fashion trends to moral decisions. And when used strategically, it can build trust, speed up group decisions, or even diffuse tension. In Squid Game, social proof is everywhere. During the first vote to leave the game, the decision swings based on how others cast their votes, not on logic, but on momentum. When one player stands up to volunteer for a deadly game, others follow. Not because they want to, but because the group already has. Even small things, like who people choose as partners, are shaped less by merit and more by what others are doing. In real life, understanding social proof can help you lead without forcing. Instead of convincing directly, show that others are already on board. Want people to take action? Let them see someone else go first. The primacy effect. The primacy effect is a cognitive bias that causes people to remember the first piece of information they hear better than what comes after. In short, first impressions stick. In psychology, this is well documented. Studies by Solomon Asch and others show that people form opinions based on early cues, not final ones. If your first words, actions, or choices signal confidence, competence, or warmth, everything else is filtered through that lens. Even if your later performance is average, a strong start frames you more positively. You'll see this in job interviews, where a solid opening handshake and calm intro can outweigh stumbles later, or in presentations, where the first few slides decide whether people keep listening. It's not fair, but it's real. In Squid Game, the red light, green light game is the first. And what players remember most isn't the rules. It's the horror of that opening scene. That first impression of the game defines how they act in every round afterward. Players who adapted fast to that first shock, by staying calm, reading the room, moving wisely, were more mentally prepared for what followed. They had an edge, not in ability, but in framing. In life, as in the game, the opening moment often matters more than the middle. Get the start right, the tone, the posture, the words, and you shape how the rest is received. The recency bias. Recency bias is the tendency to give more weight to the most recent information we've received, especially when making decisions or forming impressions. It's why a great closing argument can sway a jury, why the last item on a list feels most urgent, and why the end of a conversation can shift your entire memory of it. Studies in behavioral psychology including work by Hermann Ebbinghaus on memory retention, show that our minds naturally anchor to what came last. Not always what was most important, but what was most recent. This plays out in interviews, speeches, arguments, even in friendships. You might say all the right things, but if the last thing you said was careless or cold, that's what lingers. End strong, and people forgive a shaky start. It's not just about content, it's about exit tone, the final impression you leave behind. In Squid Game, consider the final vote to re-enter the game. Many players had doubts, but what tipped them wasn't logic. It was the final speech, the last look exchanged. The memory of the previous game still fresh. It's the emotional residue of what just happened that decides what happens next. In daily life, use this bias thoughtfully. When closing a deal, end with calm confidence. In a tough conversation, land on empathy. And when people walk away from you, make sure they carry the right version of you. Completion bias. Completion bias is the psychological drive to finish something simply because it's already started, even if continuing is irrational or harmful. It's what keeps people watching a boring movie just because they're halfway through, or finishing a meal they're not hungry for, or staying in a dead-end project because they've already invested so much. Behavioral economist Dan Ariely and others have shown how our brains equate completion with success, even when stopping would be smarter. It feels uncomfortable to leave things undone. But finishing isn't always winning. In fact, it can trap you. In Squid Game, this shows up with brutal clarity. Players continue through round after round, not necessarily because they want to, but because they've already survived the last. The sunk cost is emotional. They've risked too much to walk away, even if walking might be the better option. And the more they invest, time, trauma, trust, the harder it becomes to stop. It's not logic keeping them in, it's momentum. In real life, awareness of completion bias can save time, money, and energy. Ask, am I finishing this because it's valuable, or just because I started? The ability to not finish something, to stop, redirect, or walk away, is a kind of strength. It's not quitting, it's choosing. Anchoring effect. The anchoring effect is a cognitive bias where people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, when making decisions. Even when that information is arbitrary, it frames every judgment that follows. This was famously demonstrated by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman. In one study, participants spun a wheel with random numbers, then guessed the number of African countries in the UN. Those who saw a high number guessed higher. Those who saw a low number guessed lower. The number had nothing to do with Africa, but it anchored their thinking. This shows up everywhere. If a sweater is listed at $200 and then marked down to $99, it feels like a bargain, even if $99 is overpriced. Job seekers often get offers based on the first salary they mention. Anchors shape perception, not value. In Squid Game, the anchoring effect is used against the players from the start. The massive cash prize hanging over the room becomes the mental reference point. Once that number is set, every moral line they cross, betrayal, violence, manipulation, is justified against that anchor. It's not just a prize. It's a psychological anchor that distorts everything that follows. In life, be cautious of the first number, the first impression, the first comparison. It may not be accurate, just loud. Anchors can guide or mislead, depending on how aware you are of them. The spotlight effect. The spotlight effect is the tendency to believe people are noticing you more than they actually are. You feel like everyone's watching, judging, or remembering your every move, when in reality, most are focused on themselves. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky coined the term in a 2000 study where participants wore embarrassing t-shirts and overestimated how many others noticed. The truth? Most people didn't even register it. In social settings, This bias can lead to overthinking, self-consciousness, and fear of small mistakes. You might replay a comment you made in a meeting all day, while everyone else forgot it 2 minutes later. The fear of looking awkward is often far worse than the moment itself. In Squid Game, players constantly feel the gaze of others, and that tension breaks people. But the most strategic players understand this bias. During the honeycomb challenge, for example, some panic, assuming everyone is watching them fail. Others block it out, realizing no one cares what shape you got. They're too busy surviving their own. In real life, this realization is freeing. Most of the pressure you feel is imagined. You're not in a spotlight. You're in a crowd, and everyone else is worried about their own light. Carry that with you, and you move more freely. Not because you're invisible, but because you no longer need to be perfect. The foot in the door technique. The foot in the door technique is a persuasion strategy where someone starts by asking for a small favor, then follows up with a larger request. Once you agree to the first, you're more likely to say yes to the second because your brain wants to stay consistent with your earlier decision. This idea was first studied by Jonathan Friedman and Scott Fraser in 1966. In one experiment, homeowners were asked to put a small sticker in their window supporting safe driving. Later, when asked to put up a large, ugly sign on their lawn, the ones who had agreed to the sticker were far more likely to comply. Why? Because once we say yes to something small, our identity shifts. We start to see ourselves as someone who supports the cause, or the person asking. In Squid Game, this plays out before the real games even begin. The recruiter doesn't ask players to risk their lives right away. He just invites them to play a simple game of darkji for a little money, slap for slap, envelope for envelope. Once they say yes to that, they're more open to what comes next. It's a gradual escalation, and by the time the stakes are clear, the trap has already closed. In life, this principle works both ways. You can build trust step by step, but you can also be led into commitments you never intended, one small yes at a time. Micro expressions. Micro expressions are brief, involuntary facial expressions that reveal a person's true emotions, often before they can hide or control them. They flash across the face in a fraction of a second, and unless you're trained to see them, you'll likely miss them. But your brain still registers them, and sometimes your gut reacts before your logic does. Psychologist Paul Ekman, one of the pioneers in this field, found that these tiny expressions are universal. Fear, anger, contempt, sadness, joy. They all have subtle facial signatures. And while most people can fake a smile or hide frustration, micro-expressions often slip through in high-stress situations. In real life, catching a micro-expression can be the difference between trusting someone and knowing something's off. You might sense a flash of annoyance in a polite response, or notice that a smile doesn't quite reach the eyes. In Squid Game, these moments are everywhere, especially during the marble game. As players try to deceive their partners, tiny flashes of guilt, hesitation, or fear betray them. Gi-hun tries to keep calm, but his eyes flicker when he lies. Sang-woo's jaw tenses a second before he turns on Ali. The body reveals what the mouth tries to conceal. You don't need to study every face like a forensic expert. But if something feels wrong, a tone, a look, a blink too fast, it's worth pausing. Because micro-expressions don't lie. They whisper the truth, quietly and quickly. Cognitive dissonance. Cognitive dissonance is the mental discomfort we feel when our actions contradict our beliefs or values. To reduce that tension, we either change our behavior or reshape our beliefs to justify the behavior. Psychologist Leon Festinger introduced the concept in the 1950s. It explains why someone who cheats on a test might later say, "Everyone else was doing it," or why someone stays in a bad relationship but convinces themselves it's just a rough patch. It's not always conscious, but it's powerful. We want to see ourselves as consistent and good. When reality challenges that, we adjust our narrative to cope. In Squid Game, cognitive dissonance is everywhere. Take Sang-woo. He begins the game believing he's rational, principled, even noble. But as the challenges escalate, he betrays friends and crosses lines he once swore he wouldn't. To ease the dissonance, he reframes it. I had no choice. He convinces himself it was for survival, not because he's evil, but because the mind protects itself from shame by rewriting the story. In daily life, dissonance is a signal. If you feel uneasy about something you did, don't rush to justify it. Ask what value it challenged and what you'd need to do to realign. That discomfort isn't weakness. It's a compass. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to favor information that supports what we already believe, and to ignore or downplay anything that contradicts it. It's how smart people end up stuck in narrow thinking, not because they lack facts, but because they filter the facts through emotion and identity. Psychologists like Peter Wason demonstrated this in classic experiments. Participants were more likely to test ideas that confirmed their hypotheses than ones that might disprove them. It feels safer to be right than to be accurate. In daily life, this shows up everywhere. You read articles that support your opinion. You surround yourself with people who agree with you. You remember moments that reinforce your narrative and forget the ones that don't. In Squid Game, this bias plays out in how players interpret the rules. Many assume the games are simple, just childhood challenges with high stakes. They keep looking for fairness or logic in a system designed to exploit desperation. Gi-hun clings to the belief that playing with kindness will be rewarded. Even when betrayal happens around him, he filters it through hope until it's too late. The lesson isn't to become cynical. It's to notice when you're only listening to what feels good. Question your filters. Seek the data you don't want to hear. That's where growth lives, just outside your comfort zone. The halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias where our overall impression of someone, often based on one positive trait, colors how we judge everything else about them. If someone is attractive, we might assume they're also kind or intelligent. If someone speaks confidently, we might believe they're competent, even if there's no evidence. This was first studied by psychologist Edward Thorndike in the 1920s. He found that military officers rated subordinates more favorably across all traits if they thought the person was good-looking or had one standout quality. It wasn't logic, it was emotional spillover. In everyday life, this shows up in hiring decisions, dating, even classroom grading. A good first impression can inflate how people see your abilities, intentions, and even your morality. In Squid Game, the halo effect plays a dangerous role. Ali, the kind and loyal player, is seen as trustworthy, and he is. But that perception leads him to let his guard down. He believes Sang-woo is honest too, because Sang-woo appears calm, composed, educated. Ali doesn't question his partner's fairness until it's too late. The halo masked the danger. Awareness of this bias doesn't mean becoming suspicious of everyone. It means separating traits from assumptions. Just because someone seems impressive doesn't mean they're aligned with your values or your interests. Judge actions, not vibes. Negativity bias. Negativity bias is the psychological tendency to give more weight to negative experiences than positive ones. It's why one rude comment can ruin your day, even if 10 people complimented you, or why you remember failures more vividly than wins. Psychologists Paul Rozin and Edward Roisman showed that bad is stronger than good in memory, attention, and emotional impact. From an evolutionary standpoint, this made sense. Remembering threats helped us survive. But today, it distorts perception. It makes us overly cautious, hypercritical, and slow to trust. In daily life, this bias shows up in relationships, performance reviews, even news consumption. We replay criticism more than praise. We prepare for the worst, even when things are going well. In Squid Game, negativity bias amplifies fear. One failure, like seeing a player eliminated in the red light, green light game, sends shockwaves through the group. Even those who haven't moved panic. The memory of risk overwhelms logic. And as the games progress, players remember betrayal more than loyalty, pain more than purpose. Understanding this bias helps create perspective. Not to ignore danger, but to balance the mental scale. One bad moment doesn't erase the good, but if you let it, it will take up all the space. In-group bias. In-group bias is the tendency to favor people we perceive as part of our group, and to view outsiders with more suspicion, even when the differences are minor or arbitrary. It's an ancient instinct rooted in survival. Tribes meant protection, strangers meant threat. But in modern life, it leads to blind loyalty, poor judgment, and missed opportunities. Henry Tajfel, a British social psychologist, demonstrated this using minimal group experiments. He randomly divided participants into groups based on meaningless criteria, like preference for abstract paintings, and found they still favored their own group when giving rewards or making decisions. Even meaningless labels created real bias. In the real world, this shows up in workplaces, schools, politics, and social circles. We unconsciously trust people who share our background, interests, or identity, and we discount or distrust those who don't, even if they pose no threat. In Squid Game, this bias becomes deadly. Early on, the players form alliances based on shared language, region, or familiarity. But as the games continue, those bonds blind them. They overlook warning signs. They prioritize loyalty to their team over smarter individual strategies. And when betrayal comes, as it always does, it feels personal, not inevitable. Understanding in-group bias helps you question automatic trust. Familiarity isn't the same as reliability. Sometimes the safest person isn't the one who looks like you, but the one who proves themselves over time. The sunk cost fallacy. The sunk cost fallacy is when we continue a behavior or decision not because it makes sense, but because we've already invested time, money, or emotion into it. We stay in toxic jobs, broken relationships, or failing projects simply because we've come this far. Even when walking away would clearly be the smarter move. Economists define sunk costs as resources that can't be recovered. What's already spent is gone. But psychologically, we hate waste. So we throw good energy after bad, hoping to justify past choices instead of accepting loss. In everyday life, this shows up when someone keeps attending a degree program they hate because they've already completed 2 years, or continues binge-watching a show they stopped enjoying just to see how it ends. The fear of wasted effort outweighs the logic of better options. In Squid Game, the sunk cost fallacy is the backbone of the show. After the first vote ends the game, players return home, broke, bruised, and traumatized. But then, most come back voluntarily. Why? Because they've already suffered. They tell themselves the pain only makes sense if it leads to something. They don't want their misery to be meaningless. So they double down on the gamble. But pain doesn't become noble just because you keep choosing it. Quitting isn't weakness when the reason you're continuing is just history. The smart move is the one that serves your future, not the one that justifies your past. The false consensus effect. The false consensus effect is the tendency to overestimate how much other people share our beliefs, preferences, and behaviors. We assume our view is common sense, that others would act the way we would, or at least agree with us deep down. But most of the time, they don't. This bias was named by social psychologist Lee Ross in the 1970s. He found that people not only believed their opinions were widely held, but that those who disagreed must be misinformed or irrational. It's how we fall into echo chambers, not just socially, but cognitively. In real life, this leads to awkward surprises. You might casually joke about something, assuming everyone's on the same page, and realize you've offended someone, or assume your teammates agree with a decision, only to learn they just didn't speak up. It's easy to confuse silence with agreement. In Squid Game, this plays out during the vote to end the first game. Many players believe others will want to continue, or that quitting would make them look weak. But the final vote is nearly split. Some are shocked when the vote ends the game. Even more are surprised when others return. The false consensus effect blinds you to silent resistance. It makes you overlook real differences. If you're making a high-stakes choice, don't assume the group is aligned just because no one's arguing. Ask, listen, confirm. Because consensus isn't what you think, it's what you check. Group polarization. Group polarization is the psychological phenomenon where people in a group tend to make more extreme decisions than they would individually, often moving toward more risk, more aggression, or more confidence in their views. The group doesn't balance out opinions, it amplifies them. First studied by social psychologists like Serge Moscovici, this effect shows how simply being in a like-minded group can push moderate individuals into taking radical positions. Why? Because agreement creates momentum, and no one wants to be the one slowing it down. In real life, group polarization shows up in online communities, political rallies, and corporate strategy rooms. You might start with a simple idea, but in a charged group setting, it escalates. A protest turns into a riot. A business pitch turns into overcommitment. A complaint turns into a lawsuit. You leave the room wondering how the group ended up there, and realize it happened in small steps. In Squid Game, polarization is clearest during the night riots. One or two players start violence, then fear spreads, and suddenly, what began as isolated panic turns into mob aggression. Even the calmest participants are pulled into survival mode. The group, as a whole, becomes more dangerous than any one individual. To protect yourself from polarization, pause before following the crowd. Ask, would I feel this strongly if I were alone? Would I still act this way without the group's energy behind me? Because sometimes the most radical move is staying still when everyone else starts running. The illusion of transparency. The illusion of transparency is the tendency to overestimate how clearly others can perceive our internal thoughts, emotions, or intentions. We think our anxiety is obvious. Our doubts are visible. Our guilt is written all over our face. But usually, it's not. Psychologists Thomas Gilovich and Kenneth Savitsky demonstrated this in a series of experiments where participants were asked to lie or hide nervousness. They believed their discomfort was obvious. Observers, however, could rarely detect it. The inner storm often looks like a blank face to others. In real life, this bias makes us over-explain, over-apologize, or underperform. We assume everyone knows we're nervous in a presentation, or that our hesitation is obvious in a negotiation. So we act smaller, trying to control damage that hasn't even been noticed. In Squid Game, this illusion appears when players freeze during red light, green light, not just physically, but mentally. They believe the cameras can see their panic, that others can sense their fear, but no one can. The game only punishes motion, not emotion. Those who understand that stay composed longer. Those who don't often break. The truth is, you're more opaque than you think. People aren't mind readers. They're pattern readers. They don't see your nerves unless you act on them. So next time you feel exposed, remember, your panic isn't broadcasting, it's whispering. And most people aren't even tuned in. The Dunning-Kruger effect. The Dunning-Kruger effect describes a cognitive bias where people with low ability at a task overestimate their skill, not because they're arrogant, but because they lack the knowledge to recognize their own limitations. And ironically, those who are truly competent often underestimate themselves because they're more aware of what they don't know. Psychologists David Dunning and Justin Kruger first tested this at Cornell University in the late 1990s. Participants who scored in the bottom quartile of grammar and logic tests believed they had performed above average, while those who scored highest assumed their performance was only average. Ignorance breeds overconfidence. Expertise breeds humility. You see this in the real world constantly. The loudest person in the meeting is rarely the one with the deepest insight. The beginner who just read one article suddenly speaks like an expert. Meanwhile, the person who truly understands a subject hedges their language, adds nuance, and stays quiet, because they're aware of the complexity. In Squid Game, this bias shows up in subtle character dynamics, especially in the marble game. The confident gangster Zhang Deok-su assumes strength will carry him, but completely misjudges the emotional intelligence needed to survive a partner-based game. Meanwhile, Ali, humble, thoughtful, kind, trusts too much and underestimates his own strategic potential, losing to a man who weaponizes guilt. Confidence didn't equal competence, and awareness didn't guarantee action. You also see it earlier when players rush into alliances, loudly asserting leadership roles as if volume equals vision. But it's often the quiet players, like Saebyok, who observe, listen, and adapt with precision. The takeaway: loud doesn't mean right, and quiet doesn't mean weak. Competence isn't always visible, and the people you underestimate are sometimes the ones playing the long game. Self-serving bias is the tendency to attribute our successes to internal factors, like talent or effort, while blaming our failures on external ones, like bad luck, unfair rules, or difficult people. It's a quiet ego defense, not always loud or visible, but persistent in shaping how we interpret the world around us. In everyday life, this shows up more than we notice. If you ace an interview, you might credit your preparation or charisma. If you bomb it, you might say the questions were unclear or the interviewer was cold. When someone cuts you off in traffic, they're a reckless idiot. But when you do it, you're just in a hurry. This isn't always selfish. It's human. It protects self-esteem and helps us feel in control. But it also blinds us to growth, because anything we don't own, we can't improve. In Squid Game, self-serving bias appears in small, revealing cracks between the players. When Deok-su loses influence, he blames betrayal. When Sang-woo manipulates Ali, he justifies it as necessity. When Gi-hun survives a round, he credits his morals. But when he fails to act, he blames confusion or lack of time. Nobody admits their full role. Everyone paints themselves better than they are. Even the decision to return to the game after the vote hinges on this. They don't say, "I chose greed." They say, "I had no choice." But awareness of this bias is power, because when you start seeing your own spin, when you ask, "What part of this is mine?" you stop outsourcing responsibility. And in games where lives are on the line, or even just relationships, that honesty can be the only thing that keeps you from repeating your worst moves. The bystander effect. The bystander effect is a psychological phenomenon where people are less likely to help someone in need when others are present. The more people who witness an emergency, the less personal responsibility each individual feels to act. It's not cruelty, it's diffusion. If no one else is doing something, maybe it's not my job either. The term gained prominence after the 1964 murder of Kitty Genovese in New York, where multiple neighbors reportedly heard her cries for help. Yet no one intervened in time. Psychologists Bib Latane and John Darley ran follow-up experiments and confirmed that people feel less accountable when surrounded by others who also do nothing. Inaction becomes a social cue. In everyday life, this shows up quietly. A student being bullied in class while peers look away. Someone struggling on a subway, ignored by a packed car. A colleague harassed at work while others pretend not to notice. Not because they don't care, but because everyone is watching each other, not acting. In Squid Game, The bystander effect plays out in the dormitory scenes. When a player is attacked in the night, others remain still. They wait, frozen, not out of malice, but uncertainty. Even when Gi-hun cries out, others hesitate, unsure if it's their place, unsure if it's safe. Later, when the riot erupts, that hesitation costs lives. But it's also visible in smaller moments. No one questions the rules. No one asks about the guards. Because when everyone is silent, silence feels correct. Overcoming the bystander effect takes conscious effort. Don't wait for someone else to step in. Be the one who breaks the pattern. Because in high-stakes environments, silence is rarely neutral. It's permission. The just world hypothesis. The just world hypothesis is the belief that people get what they deserve, that good actions lead to good outcomes, and bad actions bring punishment. It's comforting. It makes the world feel fair, predictable, and morally ordered. But it's also a dangerous illusion. Psychologist Melvin Lerner coined the term in the 1960s after observing how people tend to blame victims for their suffering. Not because they're cruel, but because it feels easier to believe the victim must have done something to deserve it than to admit that life is random and unfair. You see this in the real world all the time. Someone loses their job and people ask, did they work hard enough? Someone is robbed and others wonder, were they being careless? It's not curiosity, it's defense. Because if bad things happen for no reason, then none of us are truly safe. In Squid Game, this bias is everywhere. Many players justify continuing the game because they assume everyone there deserves to be there, that their debts are proof of failure or moral weakness. When people die, it feels harsh, but not entirely unjust. There's a quiet logic in the cruelty. You lost, therefore you're unworthy. The guards exploit this mindset by never explaining the rules beyond what's necessary, letting people fill in the rest with moral assumptions. Even the VIPs watching the games lean into this belief. They bet on the players like it's a sport, convinced that winners are inherently superior. They see survival as merit, not circumstance. But in truth, the game is stacked. Luck, timing, alliances, these matter more than virtue. And believing in a fair system just delays your realization that it isn't one. Let go of the need to believe everything is fair, and start paying attention to what's actually happening. The actor-observer bias is a tendency to explain our own actions based on external circumstances, while judging others' actions as reflections of their character. When you snap at someone, it's because you had a long day. When they do it, it's because they're rude. We give ourselves context. We give others labels. This bias was first identified by psychologists Edward Jones and Richard Nisbett in 1971. Their research showed that people often shift their explanations depending on whether they're the ones acting or just observing. It's not hypocrisy, it's perspective. As the actor, you see the pressure. As the observer, you only see the behavior. In Squid Game, this bias plays out in countless micro-moments. When Gi-hun lies about his financial situation to his daughter, we forgive him, because we've seen his desperation. But when Sang-woo lies to Ali, viewers label him a villain, even though he's driven by the same fear, because we're positioned as observers, not participants. The same happens with the doctor, who secretly partners with guards. The players see betrayal, but the audience, with more context, sees survival instinct and manipulation by authority. Inside the game, the bias becomes fatal. Players judge each other quickly, forming alliances based on shallow impressions. They rarely pause to ask what pressure someone might be under, what fear they're hiding, or what logic they're following. That lack of empathy accelerates division. Outside the game, this bias still costs relationships, especially in conflict. You excuse your lateness because of traffic. You judge theirs as laziness. Awareness of this trick softens judgment. And in tense situations, that can be the difference between escalation and understanding. The ostrich effect refers to the tendency to avoid negative information. to metaphorically bury your head in the sand, like an ostrich, in hopes that ignoring a threat will make it go away. The term was coined by behavioral economists to explain why people avoid checking their bank accounts when they're in debt, or delay medical checkups when something feels off. It's not laziness, it's emotional protection. Avoiding bad news gives temporary relief, but at the cost of long-term consequences. It's a defense mechanism that works until it doesn't. You've seen this in your own life, putting off opening a bill because it feels overwhelming, avoiding a difficult conversation because you fear the outcome, delaying test results because no news feels better than bad news. In Squid Game, the ostrich effect shows up early, after the first game. Despite the mass casualties, most players vote to return to the real world. But once home, they quickly realize they're still trapped, just by different rules. And yet, instead of confronting the systems that put them there, most choose to return to the game. Not because it's safer, but because it's clearer. Even within the game, players avoid asking hard questions about the guards, the rules, or the organizers. They comply, play along, and stay quiet. Not because they trust, but because knowing more might be worse. But uncertainty doesn't vanish when ignored. It grows. Resisting the ostrich effect means looking at what you fear, even when it's uncomfortable. Because clarity, even when painful, is always safer than blindness. The illusion of control. The illusion of control is the tendency to overestimate how much influence we have over outcomes, especially in uncertain or high-stress situations. Coined by psychologist Ellen Langer in 1975, it explains why people feel more confident when they roll their own dice, or why gamblers bet more money when they choose the numbers themselves. We crave the feeling of agency, even when it's an illusion. In everyday life, this bias shows up in subtle ways. We knock on wood, avoid walking under ladders, or double-check emails 5 times before sending. Not because it guarantees anything, but because it feels like control. In situations where we're powerless, we reach for rituals, routines, or even blame. Anything to restore the illusion that we're steering the ship. In Squid Game, this illusion is everywhere. During the marble game, each player chooses their own rules. At first glance, it feels empowering. They get to decide the terms, but the truth is brutal. No matter the rules, someone will lose. The illusion gives them momentary comfort, but not safety. Even earlier, players form teams and strategize for upcoming games, despite knowing almost nothing about what's coming. They assign beds, form alliances, and even debate ethics, all to feel like they're shaping their own destiny. But the core mechanics are already locked. The game never promised fairness, only rules. Understanding the illusion of control doesn't mean giving up. It means recognizing where your power ends, and not wasting mental energy beyond that line. Because confidence built on real awareness will always outlast comfort built on false certainty. The false uniqueness effect. The false uniqueness effect is the belief that our strengths, opinions, or experiences are more rare or exceptional than they really are. We assume our ideas are original, our values uncommon, our insights sharper. It's a quiet kind of ego, one that doesn't shout but subtly inflates. Psychologists have studied this bias across different domains. People consistently rate their generosity, intelligence, or driving skills above average. They believe their moral choices are purer, their fears more complex, their perspective more woke. But in truth, most people occupy the same crowded bell curve. In the real world, this bias can isolate us. You might withhold your opinion in a meeting, assuming no one else sees what you see, only to hear the same idea said later. Or you may avoid asking for help, thinking your struggle is unique, when in fact it's deeply human. In Squid Game, this plays out in how players assess their value. Sang-woo believes his education makes him a strategist, more deserving. Gi-hun sees himself as morally superior. Even Ali, kind and loyal, assumes his purity sets him apart. But when the marble game begins, all of that collapses. Everyone thinks they'll outwit the system until they realize their partner thinks the same. Each player assumes their kindness, cleverness, or toughness makes them exceptional, and each is shocked when it doesn't save them. The lesson is simple. You're not alone in your brilliance. And that's not an insult. It's a relief. Because when you stop performing uniqueness, you can start building connection. The Pygmalion effect. The Pygmalion effect describes how people tend to rise or fall to the expectations placed upon them, especially by those in positions of authority. Coined by psychologist Robert Rosenthal, the concept gained traction after a classroom study in which teachers were, falsely, told that certain students were gifted. Months later, those students actually performed better, not because they were smarter, but because they were treated like they were. It works because belief shapes behavior. If someone expects you to succeed, they tend to give you more time, more feedback, more eye contact, and more trust. Over time, that extra investment becomes internalized. You try harder. You perform better. Not to impress, but because someone believed you could. In Squid Game, this shows up in the subtle way players begin to treat themselves based on how others see them. Gi-hun is dismissed early on as a fool, so he leans into it. He hides his sharpness until it's almost too late. Se-byuk, quiet and suspicious, is never fully trusted, so she never fully connects. And Ali, praised for his loyalty, continues to act with integrity, even when it costs him everything. One of the clearest moments of the Pygmalion effect happens during team formation. When weaker players are picked last, they internalize that dismissal. They start the game already doubting their place. And that mindset, not just muscle, influences performance. Expectations aren't just projections, they're scaffolding. And knowing this means two things. Be careful whose expectations you accept, and be generous with the ones you offer to others. The planning fallacy is the tendency to underestimate how long a task will take, even when we've done something similar before and should know better. Coined by psychologists Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, it's a kind of optimism bias that tricks us into thinking we'll finish faster, encounter fewer problems, and stay perfectly on schedule. Spoiler, we almost never do. In real life, this shows up everywhere. From students thinking they can write an essay the night before it's due, to teams setting launch dates without budgeting for delays, distractions, or second drafts. Even when we account for worst case, we usually don't account for everything else. The small tasks, interruptions, or emotional burnout. In Squid Game, the planning fallacy appears in how players mentally prepare for each round. After surviving the first few games, they assume future challenges will be predictable, perhaps even easier. They rest, strategize, make emotional alliances, confident that their past survival gives them an edge. But then comes the glass bridge. The players assume they'll have time to think, time to test, time to decide. But the timer counts down, and the panic sets in. No one budgeted for fear. The fallacy isn't just about misjudging time, it's about overestimating control and underestimating friction. And that applies far beyond deadly games. We assume we'll wake up early, focus immediately, and finish that project in one sitting until real life steps in. Avoiding the planning fallacy means planning not just for tasks, but for resistance. Always add margin, always expect friction, because finishing late isn't a failure, it's just human. The endowment effect. The endowment effect is a cognitive bias where people assign more value to things simply because they own them. It's not about the object's true worth, it's about attachment. Psychologist Richard Thaler, one of the pioneers of behavioral economics, showed that people often demand more money to sell an item they own than they'd be willing to pay to buy the exact same thing. Ownership inflates value, even when logic disagrees. In daily life, this plays out. when you keep old clothes you never wear, refuse to sell something you don't use, or cling to an idea just because it's yours. It's why people hesitate to abandon a failed project, a relationship that's run its course, or a career path they chose years ago. Because the moment something feels like mine, we become emotionally invested, and letting go feels like a loss. In Squid Game, the endowment effect is clearest in the vote after the first game. The players are given the option to leave, and most do. But the money, suspended in that giant orb above their heads, changes things. They haven't won it, but they've seen it, almost touched it. And suddenly, it feels like it belongs to them. That illusion of ownership makes them return. Not because their odds improved, but because leaving would now feel like losing something they almost had. The lesson: just because something feels like yours doesn't mean it's worth keeping. Be careful not to confuse emotional attachment with real value. Sometimes walking away is not a loss. It's freedom. Benefactance. Bias. Benefactance bias is the human tendency to take personal credit for positive outcomes while deflecting blame for negative ones. Coined by psychologist Anthony Greenwald, it combines two ideas: benefit and effectance, our need to see ourselves as competent, moral, and effective agents of good. In everyday life, it looks like this. When your team crushes a project, you remember your contributions vividly. When it falls apart, the reasons are external. Bad timing, unclear instructions, someone else dropped the ball. It's not lying, it's self-preservation, a subtle distortion that keeps your self-image intact. This bias helps explain workplace conflict, failed group projects, and fragile egos. Because when everyone believes they're the reason things went right, and no one believes they're to blame when things go wrong, collaboration breaks down fast. In Squid Game, this is everywhere. When players survive a round, they tell themselves it was their strategy, their instincts, their strength. When they lose a teammate, it's the game's cruelty or someone else's betrayal. Sang-woo rationalizes deception as necessity. Gi-hun avoids guilt by focusing on how he had no choice. Even the VIPs, watching from above, view the whole setup as meritocratic, as if the winners deserve to win. Benefactance bias keeps people feeling clean while making dirty choices, but it also blinds us to responsibility, which is dangerous in any high-stakes system. Recognizing this bias won't stop it, but it can soften it. When things go well, ask, did I really do that alone? When they don't, ask, what part of this is mine to own? The IKEA effect. The IKEA effect is a psychological phenomenon where people place disproportionately high value on things they helped create, even if the end result is flawed. Coined by Michael Norton and colleagues, the term comes from the simple insight: if you build a wobbly IKEA shelf yourself, you'll still think it's beautiful, because effort creates attachment. In everyday life, this shows up when people overvalue a project just because they spent weeks on it, defend a poorly written story because they wrote every word, or cling to a startup idea that's failing. Not because it's good, but because it's theirs. Effort becomes part of the identity. Letting go doesn't just feel like quitting. It feels like erasing yourself. In Squid Game, the IKEA effect reveals itself in how players become increasingly committed to survival strategies they've built, even when those strategies stop working. Alliances form not based on logic, but on shared effort. Sae-byok sticks with the girl she just met. Gi-hun can't let go of Sang-woo, even after repeated betrayals. Why? Because they built something, however fragile, and abandoning it would mean all that emotion was wasted. Even the returning players, those who left the game and came back, are locked in by this effect. They've already risked something, already chosen. To walk away now would mean none of that pain meant anything. The IKEA effect is a bias, not a virtue. Sometimes what you built isn't worth keeping. and sometimes what you didn't build might be better. The hard part isn't knowing what's valuable, it's accepting that value isn't always earned through effort. The mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is a psychological principle where people develop a preference for things simply because they're familiar. Originally studied by psychologist Robert Zayonk, it's the reason we grow to like a song after hearing it 5 times, or why a stranger we pass daily starts to feel trustworthy. Not because of who they are, but because we've seen them before. This bias is subtle but powerful. In real life, it explains why brands invest so heavily in repeated advertising, or why people are more likely to date someone they've sat near in class. Familiarity breeds comfort, and comfort often gets mistaken for value, trust, or even attraction. In Squid Game, the mere exposure effect influences alliances. The players don't know each other's backstories, skills, or intentions, but they begin to trust the people they sleep beside, eat next to, or see across the room each day. Not because of evidence, just repetition. This is how Gi-hun and Sae-byok begin to trust one another, despite coming from completely different worlds. It's also why betrayal stings so much. When someone familiar hurts you, it shatters not just safety, but illusion. This effect can be both helpful and dangerous. It allows trust to form quickly in unfamiliar settings, but it also means we might overlook better allies or opportunities simply because they're new. The mind prefers what it's seen before, even when what it needs is change. To outsmart the bias, recognize that comfort isn't the same as compatibility. Familiar doesn't always mean right, it just means repeated. The pseudo-certainty effect. The pseudo-certainty effect describes how people tend to make risk-averse decisions when faced with uncertainty, even if those decisions don't actually reduce the risk. Coined in behavioral economics by Kahneman and Tversky, this bias tricks us into choosing options that feel safer, simply because they give the illusion of control or clarity. Here's how it plays out in real life. In a medical trial, patients might choose a treatment with a lower success rate just because its risks are stated more clearly. In investing, someone might pull out of a volatile but promising fund to put money in a guaranteed low return account, not because it's better, but because it feels more certain. When emotions run high, we often reach for the clearest path, not the best one. In Squid Game, the pseudo-certainty effect is everywhere. When players are forced to pick a number before the glass bridge game, many avoid choosing positions at the start or end. They cluster in the middle, assuming it's safest, even though they have no idea what the challenge is yet. That choice isn't strategic, it's psychological. They're grasping for something that feels less risky, even if no logic supports it. This effect also drives players to cling to alliances that no longer benefit them, simply because they understand those people, even if they're dangerous. The lesson? Clarity is comforting, but not always accurate. Don't let the appearance of safety override smarter risk assessment. Certainty is often an illusion, and illusions cost more than risk. The decoy effect is a cognitive bias that shifts your preferences based on how options are presented. It works like this. Introduce a third, less attractive option next to 2 choices, and suddenly one of the originals seems more appealing. Not because it changed, but because the decoy made it look better by comparison. This is common in pricing. You see a small popcorn for $4, a large for $7, and a medium for $6.50. You buy the large, not because it's better value, but because the overpriced medium makes it feel like a deal. The decoy doesn't exist to be chosen. It exists to manipulate the choice. In Squid Game, this bias shows up in the marble game. The challenge isn't just psychological, it's emotional. Some players choose opponents they think they can beat, but many make their decisions based on context. Who looks weak, who seems scared, who they have a personal edge over. That context becomes the decoy, It shapes perception without improving odds. More subtly, the old man, Il Nam, presents himself as frail and confused, a human decoy. By lowering others' expectations, he avoids becoming a target. His presence makes other players look like better threats, which directs pressure away from him. The decoy effect reminds us that choice is rarely objective. Our decisions are shaped by the frame around them. To resist the trick, pause when one option suddenly looks obvious. Ask, is this better, or just better by contrast? False attribution error, sometimes called fundamental attribution error, is the tendency to explain someone's actions by their personality while ignoring the context. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you assume they're rude or selfish. Not that they might be late for the hospital, but when you do the same thing, it's because of circumstances. We're wired to assume behavior reflects character, especially under stress. This bias simplifies a messy world, turning nuanced situations into clear judgments. The problem is, it's often wrong. In Squid Game, this error surfaces early. When Gi-hun sees Deoksu acting violently, he assumes he's just a brute. When Sang-woo makes quiet, pragmatic decisions, others assume he's calm and trustworthy. Even when people betray or manipulate, the others explain it as who they are, rather than recognizing the game's brutal incentives pushing everyone to the edge. This misreading leads to fatal mistakes. Players trust those who seem moral. They underestimate those who act desperate. They fail to ask, what situation is this person in? What pressure are they under? In real life, we do this constantly. In relationships, politics, even at work, we assume intent from outcomes. We think we know someone after one bad interaction. But understanding human behavior means asking not just who someone is, but what they're dealing with. Projection bias is the tendency to assume that others share our current thoughts, values, or emotional states, especially in decision-making. When you're angry, you assume others must be irritated too. When you're hungry, you imagine that you will also be hungry. It's a distortion, a belief that the present version of yourself is stable and universal. This bias can be dangerous in both negotiation and planning. People overestimate how much others think like them, which leads to poor judgment, mismatched expectations, and emotional misreads. You might think someone's being cold when they're just tired. You might assume your priorities are shared when they're not even on the other person's radar. In Squid Game, this bias plays out during the marble challenge. Many players approach the game expecting others to play fairly, or emotionally, because that's how they themselves would play. Ali trusts Sang-woo not because it's strategic, but because he projects his own loyalty onto him. That trust is manipulated and ultimately betrayed, because Ali couldn't imagine someone else choosing differently than he would. The antidote to projection bias is emotional distance, reminding yourself that your state is not universal. Good decisions require you to zoom out, not just to think, what would I do, but to ask, what might they do? The peak end rule, introduced by psychologist Daniel Kahneman, suggests that people judge an experience largely based on how they felt at its emotional peak and at its end, rather than the total sum or average of every moment. It's why a vacation with one magical evening can feel amazing, even if most of it was uneventful, or why a painful experience with a calm, positive ending is remembered as less distressing than it actually was. In real life, this trick shapes how we remember jobs, relationships, or even entire years. An average project that ends with praise often feels better than a great one that ends in silence. A friend who disappoints you once, but right at the end, can suddenly redefine the entire connection. It's a shortcut our brains use to compress memory. In Squid Game, the creators of the deadly contest use the peak end rule to manipulate how players perceive their time inside. For example, after the chaos of the first game, the players are given lavish meals, soft lighting, and polite hosts. It's not kindness, it's design. The contrast between brutality and comfort creates an emotional peak. And at the end of each game, there's always a moment of relief, reflection, or bonding. That closing emotion doesn't erase the horror, but it reframes it. It makes people feel like they got through something, even if that something was engineered to kill. In life and in games, people rarely remember everything, just the high points and how it ended. The labeling technique is a psychological tactic rooted in self-consistency theory. It works like this. If you assign someone a positive identity label, you seem like someone who's really thoughtful. They're more likely to behave in ways that align with that label. We all like to be seen positively, and once labeled, we unconsciously adjust our actions to maintain that image. It's why teachers who say, "You're a leader in this group," see more leadership behavior. Or why telling a child, "You're very generous," often leads them to share more. People want to prove the label right, especially if it flatters or elevates them. In Squid Game, labeling shows up subtly. Gi-hun calls Ali a good person early in the series. That moment is brief but powerful. From then on, Ali's lives up to it, helping, trusting, staying loyal, even when it puts him at risk. Later, the irony of that label becomes painful, but the technique itself is clear. Once people are named a certain way, they act to preserve that identity. The danger is when labeling is used manipulatively, or when it traps people in boxes they didn't choose. But when used ethically, it can encourage people to rise to better versions of themselves. Call someone brave, and you might just help them act that way when it matters. The illusion of asymmetric insight is a psychological bias where we believe we understand others better than they understand us. It makes us think we can read people, their motives, fears, intentions, while assuming our own thoughts are more complex, hidden, or unreadable. In everyday life, this shows up in meetings, friendships, even casual interactions. You might catch someone's micro-expression or offhand comment and feel like you've got their number. Meanwhile, you believe your own doubts and intentions are invisible, when in fact, others may be reading you just as closely. This illusion creates an uneven playing field. You assume you're holding the mirror, when actually you're both standing in front of one. In Squid Game, this bias appears in countless moments, especially during the quieter interactions between players. Gi-hun thinks he sees through Sang-woo, the educated, calm one. Ali thinks kindness means trust. Deok-soo assumes strength makes him unpredictable. But all of them are being watched, analyzed, second-guessed. Players think they have more insight into others than others have into them, and this false confidence makes them sloppy. They trust when they shouldn't, lie when it's too obvious, and show weakness, thinking no one will notice. In a game, or life, where perception is power, assuming you're the only one doing the reading is one of the fastest ways to be misread. The pseudo-commando syndrome. Pseudo-commando syndrome describes a psychological profile, often found in individuals who become obsessed with control through violence. First identified in forensic psychology, it refers to people who stockpile resentment, isolate themselves, and fantasize about a final act of revenge or dominance, not out of impulse, but through planned, self-righteous destruction. These individuals typically believe the world has wronged them, and their aggression is a form of justice. In the real world, it can appear far more subtly. The co-worker who believes everyone's out to get them and starts playing aggressive office politics. The friend who justifies cruelty by claiming they're just being honest. The online commenter who frames their anger as truth-telling, while hiding their bitterness under bravado. In Squid Game, this psychology is embodied most clearly in Yang Deok-soo, the gangster who dominates early games with intimidation, impulsive violence, and a warped sense of entitlement. He believes his aggression makes him a leader. But as alliances shift and stakes rise, his reliance on fear isolates him. His downfall isn't just about strategy. It's the natural end of someone who sees others as obstacles instead of allies. The lesson is clear. Real strength is adaptability, not aggression. If you frame every interaction as a war, you will end up alone, even if you win a few battles along the way. The curse of knowledge is a cognitive bias where, once you know something, you forget what it was like not to know it. It's why teachers sometimes explain complex ideas too quickly. It's why experts often underestimate how confused their audience might be. And it's why smart people sometimes make poor leaders. They assume everyone sees what they see. In everyday life, this shows up in communication breakdowns. A manager says, just streamline the process, forgetting the team doesn't even know what steps exist. A friend says, you've just got to be confident, ignoring how hard that is when you haven't been taught how. When we forget the gap between what we know and what others don't, we lose the ability to guide, persuade, or even connect. In Squid Game, you see this in the marble game. Sang-woo plays against Ali, and he assumes Ali is naive, simple, unprepared. But it's Sang-woo who's cursed by knowledge. He knows how to win, but not how to teach. So instead, he manipulates. He uses his understanding to trap someone less informed, not out of strategy, but desperation. But the real lesson here isn't just about morality, it's about communication. If you want others to follow, help them see what you see, not through shortcuts, but through patience. Don't assume understanding, build it, because when you're the only one who gets it, you're not a leader. You're just alone in your own head. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also known as frequency illusion, is when you learn about something for the first time, and then suddenly start seeing it everywhere. It's not that the thing actually became more common. It's just that your brain, having flagged it as relevant, starts noticing it more. It's a mix of selective attention and confirmation bias, and it gives a false sense of significance or pattern. Marketers use it all the time. Once you hear about a brand, you start noticing its logo on bags, billboards, or YouTube ads. It creates the illusion of prevalence and importance, making you think everyone's using it, when it's really just your mind filtering reality differently. In Squid Game, this effect is visible in the way players suddenly see the game's symbols everywhere after entering the arena. The circle, triangle, and square were printed on the invitation card. But now they're all over the guards' masks, the walls, even the game structures. It's not that the symbols became more common. The players' minds just became more attuned to them. As a result, they start assigning meaning, fear, or conspiracy to things that were just design, amplifying their emotional response. This trick reminds us that once we label something as important, our brains will find it more often, whether it matters or not. Sometimes, what feels like a sign is just your attention echoing back. The contrast principle is simple. When two things are presented back to back, the difference between them feels more dramatic than it really is. Show someone a freezing room, then a mildly cold one, and the second will feel warm. Offer an expensive watch before showing a mid-priced one, and the second seems like a deal. Our brains don't evaluate things in isolation. We compare, and the first impression sets the anchor. This principle is a cornerstone of sales, negotiation, even dating. Want your offer to feel more appealing? Place something worse right before it. Want to seem more relaxed? Talk right after someone flustered. In Squid Game, the contrast principle plays out in the tug-of-war challenge. One team, full of older and weaker players, looks hopeless, especially when compared to their younger, muscular opponents. But that low expectation becomes an advantage. When they win, it's not just a victory, it's a shock. The contrast amplifies the emotional payoff, both for the players and the viewer. The game itself also contrasts safety with sudden violence, calm with chaos. This tension makes each moment feel more extreme, because what came just before was so different. In real life, contrast shapes decisions every day. If you want to be remembered, go after someone forgettable. If you want your idea to stand out, follow something dull. Timing and order matter. Not just what you say, but when and after whom. The fear, then relief technique is a persuasion strategy where someone is intentionally put under brief psychological pressure, then suddenly released, creating a moment of vulnerability that makes them more likely to comply. It's been studied in law enforcement, sales, even cult recruitment. When people experience relief after fear, they're less resistant, more agreeable, and more eager to avoid further discomfort. In real life, it might look like this. You get an email titled Urgent Final Warning, only to open it and see it's just a reminder about a policy update. The relief you feel makes you more likely to read the full message, even comply with it, because your guard was just lowered. Or a friend tells you, "We need to talk," in a serious tone, only to say it's about where to go for dinner. That gap between tension and release opens space for influence. In Squid Game, this tactic plays out in multiple layers. One of the most notable, the re-invitation to return. After players vote to leave the game, they're dropped back into their bleak lives, filled with debt and shame. Then, just when they begin to adjust, they're offered a second chance. Same risks, same horrors, but framed now as an escape. The fear of real-world suffering, followed by the relief of re-entering the game with a purpose, makes players say yes. Not because it's safer, but because the contrast made it feel like it is. In any decision, be mindful of the emotional swing. If something felt dangerous 5 minutes ago, but suddenly seems like a good idea, ask yourself, did the facts change, or just the feeling? The door-in-the-face technique is a classic persuasion strategy. You begin with a large, unreasonable request you expect to be rejected, then follow up with a smaller, more reasonable one. The contrast makes the second request feel modest, even generous, increasing the chance of acceptance. It works because of reciprocity bias. When someone turns down the first offer, they subconsciously feel like you compromised, so they should too. A real-world example. A charity might ask you to volunteer 10 hours a week. You decline. Then they ask for a one-time $10 donation. Compared to the first ask, it feels light. And you say yes. Or a coworker proposes an all-day strategy session. When you suggest just 1 hour, they're more likely to agree. You've reframed the negotiation. In Squid Game, this plays out in how the game runners manipulate consent. The initial presentation, deadly children's games for cash, is so extreme that when players vote to leave, it feels like reclaiming control. But when the game offers a second chance under the same brutal conditions, it feels more reasonable because players had already faced and rejected the bigger, more horrifying reality. The second ask benefits from the contrast. In daily interactions, notice when someone leads with an extreme request. Ask yourself, is this their real goal? And when you're asking for something yourself, remember, sometimes the best way to get a yes is to start with a no. The scarcity principle. The scarcity principle is one of the most reliable levers in human psychology. We tend to place higher value on things that are limited in availability. Whether it's time, resources, or opportunity, the less there is, the more we want it. This isn't just economic logic, it's emotional urgency. Scarcity creates pressure, focus, and action. You've seen this in everyday marketing. Only 2 left in stock, or offer ends in 5 minutes. But it shows up in subtle ways too. When someone says they're hard to reach, their time becomes more desirable. When a meeting invite lists just 3 open slots, those slots feel more valuable than if there were 20. Scarcity forces decisions faster and with more weight. In Squid Game, scarcity is everywhere. Most obviously, the prize money is limited, and so is time. But look closer. In the tug-of-war game, strength seems like the scarce resource until one player reframes it. strategy is even rarer. When knowledge, coordination, and calm become the rare elements, the team's survival chances rise. Or take alliances, there's a scarcity of trust. That's why betrayal stings so deeply, and why characters like Ali become so emotionally powerful. In real life, be aware of how scarcity influences your decisions. Are you choosing something because it's right, or because it feels urgent to grab it before it disappears? On the flip side, when presenting ideas, framing something as rare or time-bound can dramatically boost its perceived value. The false memory effect. False memories aren't just mistakes, they're manufactured truths. The brain doesn't record experiences like a camera. It reconstructs them, edits them, and sometimes inserts details that never actually happened. In studies by Elizabeth Loftus, participants confidently recalled events that were entirely fabricated, like being lost in a mall as a child, simply because a trusted source suggested it. The brain, wanting to make sense of the story, filled in the blanks. In real life, this happens more than we'd like to admit. A sibling remembers you stealing their toy, but you remember giving it back. A colleague swears you missed a meeting, but you're sure you were there. Over time, repetition and social reinforcement can make these inaccurate memories feel just as real as genuine ones. In Squid Game, this effect quietly shapes how players justify their actions. After the honeycomb game, players who succeed begin to recall their method as smart or calculated, even if they were panicking. Players who manipulated others start to believe they had no other choice. And in the marble game, the emotional chaos distorts the memory of what was fair, what was necessary, and what was betrayal. Understanding the false memory effect isn't about blaming others, it's about humility. Knowing your memory is malleable makes you less reactive, more empathetic, and more careful with how you tell your own story. Don't assume you remember perfectly. Assume you remember emotionally. And that means you might need to double-check the facts. The third-person effect is a psychological bias where people tend to believe that others are more susceptible to persuasion, media influence, or manipulation than they are themselves. It creates a subtle illusion of immunity, a belief that others might fall for that trick, but I'd never be that naive. This bias makes people underestimate how much they're being influenced and overestimate their own critical thinking. It shows up in everything from advertising to politics. When someone says, "I don't really care about that stuff, but people out there are probably buying it," they're applying this bias. Ironically, the people who claim the most independence from media influence are often the ones most vulnerable to it, because they've stopped questioning their own filters. In Squid Game, this bias appears clearly when the players vote to end the game after the first round. Many of them, especially those who return, believe that they're not like the others. They tell themselves they'll outsmart the system, that they've seen enough to stay in control. But that false sense of distance blinds them. They think manipulation only works on the desperate or the weak-willed, not on someone like me. The game exploits this perfectly. The moment you think you're above it is often the moment you fall deeper in. The fear of missing out FOMO is the anxious feeling that you're being left behind, that others are gaining experiences, advantages, or opportunities you're not part of. It's deeply social and deeply human. Entire industries thrive on it. Sales with countdown timers, social media feeds filled with curated highlights, and notifications engineered to trigger urgency. The core of FOMO isn't greed, it's the fear of exclusion. In real life, FOMO clouds judgment. People say yes to investments they don't understand because everyone else is in. They accept invites they don't want just to avoid being left out. They abandon slow, stable plans to chase someone else's fast success. It's not logic, it's panic dressed as ambition. In Squid Game, FOMO becomes deadly in the vote to end the game. After the first round's trauma, players are offered a simple out. walk away, alive. Many want to leave. But that quiet voice kicks in. What if I stay? What if I win? That what if is pure FOMO. Even in a place designed to kill them, they fear missing out more than death. The organizers know this. They weaponize uncertainty. They don't reveal the games in advance. They let the players fill in the blanks with dreams of winning, freedom, or control. And that imagined future is powerful enough to override reality. Recognizing FOMO is the first step. Whenever urgency clouds your vision, step back. Ask, would I want this if nobody else did? If the answer is no, you're probably not chasing opportunity, just avoiding being left behind. The foot in the mouth technique. The foot in the mouth technique may sound clumsy, but it's surprisingly effective. It starts with a personal question, not too deep, just enough to nudge someone into minor self-disclosure. Once they've shared something about themselves, they become more open to complying with a request. The trick works because admitting a state, like being fine or busy, triggers a subtle desire to remain consistent with that identity. Imagine someone asks, "How are you feeling today?" You say, "Pretty good, thanks." Moments later, they ask for help carrying boxes. You're now more likely to say yes. Why? Because saying you're pretty good implies you have the capacity, and denying help right after might feel contradictory. In Squid Game, this shows up in quieter exchanges. Early on, Gi-hun builds rapport with the salesman who slaps him into the game. Before the offer is made, there's a soft personal connection. Polite small talk, a game, shared laughter. By asking about his life, his job, his daughter, the salesman gets Gi-hun talking. That short emotional warm-up makes the absurd offer seem just a bit more acceptable. Gi-hun is already engaged. He's already revealed something. In high-stakes moments, connection before request is powerful. Even a quick check-in, "How are you holding up?" can soften resistance. The trick isn't manipulation. It's making people feel seen, just long enough to say yes. Pacing and leading is a communication method rooted in NLP and classic rapport-building psychology. The idea is simple. First, you match the listener's current reality, their emotions, beliefs, or behavior. And once they feel understood, you gently guide them toward a new direction. It's often used in therapy, negotiation, and leadership. When done well, it feels like agreement, not manipulation. A therapist might say, "You've been overwhelmed, and nothing seems to help." Pacing. Then, but maybe that means your system is finally rejecting old solutions. Leading. A manager might tell their team, "We're all tired, we've had setbacks, and this week's been rough." Pacing. Then, and maybe that's why finishing strong now will matter even more. Leading. It builds trust because it starts from their world, not yours. In Squid Game, this tactic is subtle but powerful, especially during the tug-of-war game. Gi-hun's team is physically weaker, and they all know it. Instead of denying that reality, Il-nam, the old man, paces their fear. He acknowledges their odds, but then he introduces a counterintuitive strategy, spacing out, holding for 10 seconds, and frames it as wisdom, not strength. Because he first mirrors their panic, they're willing to follow his lead. And it works. In your own life, start where the other person already is. Name what's real to them, then move together. People don't want to be pushed, but they're often willing to walk beside someone who seems to see the road clearly. The illusory truth effect. The illusory truth effect is one of the most quietly powerful mental shortcuts we have, and one of the easiest to exploit. In short, the more often we hear something, the more likely we are to believe it. Not because it's accurate, but because it feels familiar. Repetition tricks the brain into mistaking recognition for credibility. You see this in advertising, where a slogan repeated a dozen times lodges in your memory, whether you agree with it or not. In politics, where talking points repeated in interviews start to feel like consensus, and in conversation, where a confident lie told often enough becomes something people just accept as true. Not because they verified it, but because they've heard it before. In Squid Game, this effect plays out in subtle character dynamics. Take Gi-hun and Sang-woo. When Sang-woo repeatedly tells the others that he knows what he's doing, that he's logical, that he has a plan, the group listens. Not because of proof, but because of repetition. His confidence, restated again and again, starts to sound like truth. Even when it leads to morally grey decisions, no one challenges him, because the illusion has settled. In real life, this means the ideas you repeat about yourself, your work, your value, begin to form the way others perceive you. But it also means you should be wary of what you believe just because it feels right, especially when that feeling comes from hearing it again and again. Repeat the truth, but don't let repetition become the only reason something seems true.